On a cold winter afternoon along Route 66 outside Phoenix, a simple traffic stop turned into a nightmare that would change many lives forever. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Sarah Mitchell was driving home after a long nursing shift, the weak winter sun already sinking low in a dry, icy wind sweeping across the empty highway, and her hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel, not from fear, but from exhaustion, because she had just finished 12 straight hours caring for sick children, listening to coughs echo through hospital halls while snow clouds gathered far away over the desert mountains. And all she wanted was to reach home, wrap herself in a blanket, and sleep through the cold night. But when flashing red and blue lights suddenly filled her rearview mirror, her heart dropped, and she slowly pulled over onto the shoulder where frost clung to the edges of the road, confused because she knew she had not broken any rules. And moments later, Officer Derek Hayes stepped out of his cruiser with heavy boots crunching on gravel, his breath visible in the cold air. And he approached her window with a sharp stare and a tone that carried no warmth, asking for her license and registration, which Sarah handed over politely because she believed in doing things the right way and trusted authority like she always had. But as Hayes looked over her papers, his eyes shifted to a small Hell's Angels support sticker on her back windshield, and the cold in the air seemed to deepen as his expression hardened and his mouth curled into a cruel smile. And he ordered her out of the car without explaining why, and Sarah obeyed quietly, her winter jacket thin against the wind, still believing there must be some mistake. But Hayes demanded to know whose motorcycle club the sticker belonged to. And when she calmly said it was her husband's and asked if that was illegal, he laughed in a way that made her stomach tighten and said her husband must be a criminal. And when Sarah replied that her husband had never been arrested and that she was just a nurse trying to get home, his mood darkened further, and he suddenly grabbed her arm and twisted it behind her back, slamming her against the cold hood of her car, the metal shocking her skin through her clothes, and she cried out in pain as her face struck the surface and she tasted blood, the winter air burning her lungs as she begged him to stop and asked what she had done wrong. But Hayes ignored her pleas and shouted orders, accusing her of hiding drugs even though her car held nothing but hospital paperwork and a thermos of cold coffee. And he threw her down onto the frozen asphalt, where the chill soaked into her bones instantly. And as she lay there helpless, snowflakes beginning to drift lightly from the sky, he kicked her ribs and mocked her, telling her to pass a message to her biker husband that the police own these roads, not motorcycle clubs. And with each blow, the pain spread through her body while the cold made it hard to breathe. And then without another word, he walked back to his cruiser, tires hissing against the icy road as he drove away, leaving Sarah bleeding and shaking on the winter highway as the sky turned gray and the wind howled around her. And for nearly 20 minutes, she lay there alone, staring at the pale clouds and wondering how following the rules had led her here, until a passing truck driver spotted her, pulled over, and rushed to her side, wrapping his coat around her shoulders and calling 911 while snow gathered along the roadside. And when the ambulance finally arrived, paramedics carefully lifted her onto a stretcher, their faces tight with anger and disbelief. And at the hospital, the bright lights and familiar smells felt unreal as doctors examined her injuries, finding broken ribs, a fractured cheekbone, and deep cuts on her face. And the doctor treating her, Dr. Martinez, recognized her immediately and whispered her name in shock as tears filled his eyes, asking who could have done this. And through swollen lips and pain that pulsed with every breath, Sarah managed to whisper one word that echoed heavier than any siren in the winter night: a cop. and the room fell silent as the truth sank in. And within minutes, the hospital made the call that would set everything else in motion, reaching out to her husband, a man who ruled the Hell's Angels with iron control. And as snow continued to fall outside the hospital windows, the mistake made on that cold highway began to take shape, one that Officer Derek Hayes would come to regret for the rest of his life. Marcus Mitchell, the president of the Phoenix Hells Angels, arrived at the hospital within an hour, pushing through the sliding doors as cold winter air followed him inside. And when he saw Sarah lying in the bed with her face swollen, bruised, and stitched, something deep inside him froze solid, harder than ice, and he didn't raise his voice or show anger as he gently held her hand and asked only one question: who did this? And Sarah, struggling to speak through pain and cracked lips, whispered the name Officer Derek Hayes and then forced out the badge number 4471. And Marcus nodded slowly, as if carving the information into his memory. And when she grabbed his sleeve weakly and begged him not to do anything stupid, her voice shaking with fear and love, he leaned close and kissed her forehead and promised her he wouldn't do anything stupid, saying instead that he would do something smart. And as snow began to fall outside the hospital windows, Marcus walked out into the freezing night, already planning every step. And within 2 hours, 45 Hells Angels gather at their clubhouse, engines silent, breath fogging the air as they sat around a long table without speaking, winter coats still on, until Marcus told them exactly what had happened to Sarah. And a room filled with quiet rage as Snake spoke up, explaining that Hayes was a known dirty cop with 17 complaints of excessive force over 5 years, all dismissed because his uncle was the police chief, and Razor slammed his fist on the table. But Marcus corrected him calmly, saying the system had protected Hayes until now, and that protection was ending tonight. And what Marcus planned shocked some of them because it wasn't violence or revenge in the way people expected from bikers, but something far colder and more destructive, as he announced they wouldn't touch Hayes physically at all, but instead destroy him legally and publicly so completely that even his powerful uncle couldn't hide the truth. And the plan moved fast like a winter storm rolling in. First, by pulling every complaint ever filed against Hayes and tracking down all 17 victims who had been ignored, silenced, or threatened, including an elderly black man beaten during a wellness check on a freezing night, a teenage girl groped during a roadside search in cold rain, and a homeless veteran tasered for sleeping in a park during winter because shelters were full, and every one of them had tried to report Hayes only to be warned to stay quiet. And Marcus promised them they would be heard now, and heard loudly. And next, the club hired Patricia Chun, one of the toughest civil rights attorneys in Arizona, a woman known for tearing apart corrupt officers in court and smiling while doing it. And then they contacted every news station, journalist, and blogger who covered police abuse, handing over medical records, photos, statements, and timelines carefully collected. And the most important step came. Next, when Snake uncovered the dash cam footage Hayes thought was gone forever, buried in a deleted server backup during a winter system upgrade. And what the video showed was 23 full minutes of Officer Derek Hayes brutally beating an innocent woman on the side of a cold highway. And when the footage was released, it spread across social media like wildfire, lighting up screens everywhere. And Hayes was suspended immediately. But his nightmare was only beginning as the other 17 victims came forward within days, their stories painting a clear picture of years of abuse hidden behind a badge and protected by family connections. And as public anger grew, snowstorms rolled across the state while the FBI opened a full investigation not only into Hayes, but into the entire police department, exposing corruption that had been buried for years. And realizing the walls were closing in, Hayes tried to run, packing a bag and driving south toward the Mexican border late one freezing night. But fate brought him back to the same desert highway where Sarah had been left bleeding, now cold and empty under a pale winter moon. And suddenly his car was surrounded by 45 motorcycles forming a tight circle, headlights cutting through the darkness like blades. And Hayes reached for his gun in panic before freezing when he saw dozens of weapons aimed steadily at his windshield. And through a megaphone, Marcus ordered him to step out of the vehicle with his hands visible. And Hayes' confidence shattered as he stumbled out shaking, shouting that he was a police officer and they couldn't do this. And Marcus replied calmly that he was a criminal who happened to wear a badge and that the FBI was very interested in meeting him. And as a black SUV pulled up behind the bikes and 3 agents stepped out into the cold night air, the lead agent announced Derek Hayes was under arrest for civil rights violations, assault, evidence tampering, and corruption. And as handcuffs clicked shut, winter wind swept across the highway, carrying with it the quiet end of a man who had thought he was untouchable. Hayes stared at the ring of bikers around him as cold winter wind swept across the desert highway, disbelief written across his face while frost clung to the edges of the road, and his breath came out in short, shaky clouds. And he shouted that they had no right to call the FBI on him, his voice cracking as panic finally broke through his arrogance. And Marcus replied calmly that they had done far more than make a phone call, explaining that every victim, every ignored complaint, and every piece of footage his powerful uncle had buried during years of cover-ups had been handed over in full. And when Hayes tried to protest that his uncle would fix everything like always, Marcus interrupted him, saying respect was not about uniforms, badges, or feared symbols, but about actions and accountability. And then delivered the final blow by revealing that Hayes' uncle had already been arrested an hour earlier along with 6 other officers who helped hide his crimes. And at that moment, Hayes' legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed onto the frozen ground, his world falling apart as completely as the icy silence around them. And Marcus stepped forward and crouched down to his level, meeting his eyes without anger, but with a calm colder than winter itself, reminding him that he had beaten an innocent woman and left her bleeding on a freezing highway, believing his badge made him untouchable. And Marcus leaned in closer and told him nothing made a man untouchable and that he should remember that truth every day of his life in prison. And as FBI agents pulled Hayes to his feet and snapped cold metal cuffs around his wrists, he began to cry openly, his sobs echoing into the night as snow drifted lightly across the scene. And he was driven away not as an officer, but as a criminal stripped of protection. And the trial that followed lasted 3 long weeks during the heart of winter, with gray skies hanging over the courthouse as 18 victims took the stand one by one, their voices steady despite years of fear, telling stories of abuse, threats, and silence while jurors watched the dash cam footage play in full, showing every minute of what Hayes had done to Sarah on that cold roadside. And the courtroom grew heavier with each passing day as evidence revealed how his uncle and 6 other officers had helped erase reports, intimidate witnesses, and bury proof. And when the verdict came down, Hayes was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison for civil rights violations, assault, corruption, and evidence tampering, while his uncle received 15 years, and the remaining officers were sentenced to terms ranging from 5 to 12 years. And as the snow fell outside the courthouse, justice finally felt real for the first time in years. And on the day Sarah was released from the hospital to return home, 45 motorcycles lined the streets in a slow-moving convoy that stretched for nearly half a mile, engines rumbling softly through the cold air as neighbors stepped out onto porches wrapped in winter coats and scarves, waving and cheering not out of fear of the Hells Angels, but out of respect for what they had done. And Sarah sat in the car beside Marcus, watching familiar streets pass by under pale winter sunlight, feeling safe in a way she hadn't since that night. And months later, Hayes sat in federal prison, surrounded by men who held deep hatred for corrupt cops, learning every day what it meant to be powerless, while his uncle served time in a different facility where his former title carried no protection. And Sarah slowly healed and returned to her work as a nurse in the pediatric ward, where winter illnesses filled the halls with coughing children and worried parents. And she cared for them with the same kindness and strength she always had, choosing not to let cruelty change her heart. And the police department that once shielded Hayes underwent a complete overhaul, becoming one of the most strictly monitored departments in the state, with new leadership, oversight, and accountability standards that ensured no badge could hide abuse again. All because a group of 45 bikers refused to allow injustice to survive behind closed doors. And Marcus often visited Sarah at the hospital during the cold months, bringing her hot coffee and fresh flowers, sitting beside her during breaks while snow gathered outside the windows. And the hospital staff, who once watched him nervously, now greeted him warmly, offering smiles and conversation, because they had come to understand what Sarah had always known, that the toughest-looking people were not always the most dangerous, and that honor was proven through choices, not appearances. And as winter slowly gave way to spring, the story spread through the city as a reminder that power without integrity meant nothing, that a badge carried no value without honor, and that sometimes justice arrived not through force or fear, but through patience, truth, and a refusal to stay silent in the cold.